Yeah. Once we get going, it's usually like with Omar's, we just went all the way through it, and because and mistakes are fine. It's just that you don't want to start off with a mistake. Hi, folks. Welcome back. We're here for the next episode of View from the Easel for the Art Gallery of Northumberland, and today our feature artist is Dorothy Caldwell. Hi, Dorothy.
Hi, Dimitri.
It's
Welcome
so nice.
To the studio.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. It is really a remarkable place in the country here, off of a very remote rural road. Dorothy's studio is a building outside of her home, a separate space, and I just saw it for the first time. It is amazing. Just an amazing space to work in. So thank you for inviting us.
Thank you for coming.
Dorothy, we could talk about so many different things, but the first thing I want to ask you is, can you tell me what textile art is and isn't, maybe?
Well, that's a good question to start with. And I call myself a textile artist. I studied painting for 4 years at art school and university, and so that's my base that I'm coming from. And I came to textile later. I think I kind of started to discover textile and realize that in art school, half of the population of artists was left out of art history. And it's a different tradition. The tradition that I studied was pretty much male European white art history. Nothing wrong with it. I love that history, but very few women were included in that history. And I think when I finished school, I was painting, but I was kind of looking around for something else. And my friends who I moved to Canada with were all in the craft areas, and I thought I would maybe try something with textile. And it was a nice bridge between painting and cloth, because canvas is cloth and you can apply dye with a paintbrush. And I started by doing a batik method, drawing with a scanting tool, which draws little lines. So it was drawing and applying color with a brush. So those were familiar tools and marks, and that was how I bridged over to using textile. And then as I got into it and started to attend symposiums and lectures and read more about textile history, I became more committed to working with that tradition. And so in general, it's a women's tradition. It's based in domestic work. Women were the caretakers of cloth. They were the makers, the spinners and weavers, and then menders and repairers of fabric. And for me, one of the most wonderful qualities of cloth is that it wears out and breaks down. It's not steel, it's not ceramic, it wears out.
It's an organic material.
Yeah, and it's kind of at the juncture where fabric wears out, clothing wears out, or blankets wear out, or whatever, that women had the opportunity to make something new, because they would take the parts that were still good and either mend them or reconstruct them into something new, and that's where their creativity was able to express itself.
Essentially, they're taking something old and making it useful again.
I mean, they recycled out of necessity. We recycle out of having too much.
Yes.
But they recycled out of necessity. But they also had a freedom to use those useless pieces in a creative and expressive way. And this is how North American quilt making developed, and other techniques like the Japanese technique, which is called sashiko. It's a white stitching on an indigo background, and they are patterns of stitches that have names, like the North American quilt patterns have names. But it developed out of mending. So the Japanese form of reinforcing was to stitch lines of stitches, and that reinforced the fabric and made it last longer. And so as women were doing this, they would maybe turn a right angle or make a triangle, and they developed patterns that had names. And I think once they're named, then it becomes an official art form.
Right.
And I like that a lot of the textile arts have evolved out of those traditions. And my own work is, I think of it as repair, reconstruction, and reinforcing of cloth. And usually when I start, I really don't like what I'm working with. I don't like the fabric I've made or the marks I've made. I generally look at it as something that needs to be repaired.
Oh.
And that's how I approach it.
So you're repairing your own
Yeah.
creation.
Mm-hmm.
That's an interesting idea. It's a
Repairing
work
and
in progress.
reconstructing.
Yeah.
And so, that's my way of looking at textile,
That's
what
right.
I've come to for my own way of seeing textile.
Is there any connection with that notion of going over something with painting then? Because in painting, of course, you're always adding more paint, not always,
Mm-hmm.
but...
Yeah, it's an additive method. I mean, there's usually some repetition in stitching. I see the stitch is a little dot, actually, so it's a mark. You could make a mark
point.
with a pen,
Yeah.
or you could make a mark with a brush. And so it could be a dot, it could be a dash, or it could become a line. And so it's a lot of what I've had to do coming out of an art school background is to convince myself that textile is a credible art form and that the stitch is a credible mark. And I say, well, the stitch is a mark, just like any other mark. It's just made with a needle and thread instead of a paintbrush or a pencil. And I've thought a lot about the stitch as a mark. And
that's really fascinating because today, of course, with computers, we think about the dot and then joining dots and the vector, the sort of binary method. We're reducing things down to kind of a point. There is obviously a lot of time in the work. The passage of time is evident in the work itself. So although you might be correcting something, there's always something still remnant from the past, whether it's the found material or the purchased material or your previous marks. So it's a continual rewriting, which I think of that word, which is a literary word, palimpsest, the idea of history being a palimpsest, where one layer of history is on top of the other. And of course, ancient Rome or Rome in general is the palimpsest city in a sense, because it has a continuous history for over 2,000 years. So
that word is very appropriate for the
yeah.
way I work, and what you're saying is rings really true to me. This sort of building of history, and with the traditional textiles, building a sense of a story of a life into a cloth through repair and through the way it evolves into something new, and layers occur, and there are traces of what was there before. And that idea also relates to what the subject of my work is, which is the land and the patterns of settlement and the marks that humans have made on the land, and the way, history is built up in the land through traces of human marks or human architecture, ruins, and all of that.
Well, that brings it kind of together, doesn't it, in terms of the craft side of it? Because if you think about building itself, you don't need an artist to design a building. You don't need an architect to design a building. And many of our places in the world, many of these beautiful archaeological and living museum places, have been built up without a lot of planning, but sort of emerge somewhat more, not organically, but just slower over time.
Right.
And that is something that you're quite interested in.
Yeah.
So when you choose a landscape or a place, how do you do that? What? Because there's so many to choose from. Is travel an important part, or is research?
Well, it has been. I think the places kind of choose me. I don't really choose them. One of my first major exhibitions was called Field Notes, and it was a study of where we live in Northumberland County, and the marks of settlement, the patterns of settlement on the grid, and how the tree lines and stone lines have built, how that grid has become visible again over time. Mm-hmm. It originally was just an idea, actually thought up by Thomas Jefferson as a very logical way to mark out and distribute land to settlers. And that pattern became visible over time as roads were built along and fields were cleared and things were stacked on the field lines. And I related that to a very simple quilt pattern called the four patch, which is basically just squares, 4 squares put together. And that was how I started that series with a piece called Four Patch, Hay, Wheat, Rye, Barley, so relating it to the fields that we have here.
What year would that have been?
That would have been in the 80s, early 90s, something like that. And it was a way for me to research, the land surveys, which is very interesting, and how they evolved, and look at where I live. It was a time of studying this place where I live, so it was very personal. And other places have also chosen me. I had the opportunity to teach in Australia, and ended up going back 8 times with various grants and research projects and teaching, combined with teaching, and worked in the outback, and that's how that evolved. And then that led to working in the Arctic, the Canadian Arctic, because I wanted a parallel place that was Canadian. And the Arctic is a desert, like the parts of Australia I was working in. And we have very similar histories, similar patterns of settlement, similar Aboriginal cultures. Yeah. And so there were lots of parallels and lots of contrasts, the heat and the cold, the wet and the dry. So a lot of stuff for an artist to work with.
Must have been amazing.
Yeah.
8 times. That's amazing.
Yeah, I total up to about 1.5 years.
Wow.
So I spent a lot of time in the Australian outback, and that resulted in an exhibition.
And similarly, did you spend time in the Arctic?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Not
that much time.
I would love it to be more. I'm dying to go back to the Arctic. It's just such a beautiful landscape, and speaking about layers of land, there the layers are very almost invisible, and the big piece that I have on the wall right now was a response to walking on the tundra with an Inuit family. And, what you see is this vast landscape and this vast horizon. And you almost need to have pointed out to you the human marks, because they're so almost invisible.
Small, yeah. And,
you'll come across sort of a right angle, a little corner of stones, and they said, well, this is a food cache, or this is the corner of an old food cache, and you realize that right angle, is human. It's an architectural form, but it's so part of the landscape and so embedded. And I found that really beautiful, but because we're so used to so much human architecture and buildings and roads, and so to be in a place where they were very precious, these little indications of humanity, I found that really special. There is a very dramatic horizon line in the Arctic, like in the prairies or like anywhere where there aren't trees. And so that, you have this very horizontal line between the sky and the land. And
so it's not just, when you think about landscape, it isn't just looking at it from above. Even though the work is minimal, if you will, or compressed, you do see these landscapes both in the kind of vertical dimension and the horizontal.
Yeah, I don't see landscape as, when you say landscape, you think of a view. I don't think of it so much as a view. I think of it as this sort of layering of history, human and the natural formations, and how we place ourselves in those. And how usually you have, if you live any place for long enough, you have a sort of geological formation that makes the stage that you live on. For me, there's the lake is there. I know that's where it is, and behind me is this sort of very elegant hill form, and that sort of holds your forms of stage that you live on. And that's sort of the way I think about landscape.
And much of the time it's just in your head, right? It's not something that is always visible. For example, you can't, unlike traditional landscape painting, which is a singular view, usually denoting some sort of ownership of the landscape. This is kind of both putting the artist in the center, but also on the periphery. You don't really own the landscape. You are another living being in that landscape, and memory also plays a role. The memory of what is in your mind, but of the landscape, and it's obviously not an accurate depiction, a realistic depiction of the landscape. It's some sort of abstraction from the landscape. So
it's definitely an abstraction, and sometimes it's more literal than others. When I was in Pangerton working, there was it's quite mountainous, and there was kind of a huge cliff-like mountain and a fjord. They're on a fjord, and having worked with my little lake in the front, as looking at it as if it were a bowl holding water, the hills coming down and forming this shape that holds water. This was a whole different shape that was much more steep and long and deep. And so I worked with quite a bit with that fjord shape of a container, really. And
one thing to be in your landscape, which we're in right now, with both the interior and the exterior, when you see these new landscapes, you must, see it with an artist's sensibility where that is something you haven't seen before, and you're drawn to it, and you're special. Can you maybe tell us what role does your note-taking and sketches play in your process?
Well, I have notebooks, and I have many of them over the years, but they're just these simple, my dog chewed that, that's from the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney, Australia. But they're just these very simple books. They're not sketchbooks, which terrify me. So these are really notebooks, and I keep notes, and I might collect a little bit. I might sew something in to the notebook. I might record. One of the things I got into doing was when I travel, I record where the plane is landing. With
lines.
This is in Sydney. So when we start to descend, I just let my hand record and it's just a way of making a drawing of what's happening right at the moment, and it sort of calms your nerves.
Yeah, I like how it ends. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, there's usually more turbulence at the end.
Hopefully that's the way it goes. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's a way of saying, okay, this is where I am now, and a way of kind of dividing my. That was landing in Melbourne, and
really...
so throughout when I'm traveling, I'll do the landing drawing, and then. The next bit. So a lot of it is just notes I take, maybe if I'm in a museum or out in the land, or, there may be drawings, like these are drawings from the air of fields out west where they irrigate. I love the different shapes those make.
I mean, the thing that really pops out for me, because I haven't seen these before, is how much they look like your final works.
Yeah.
Obviously, they're not your final works, but there is an analogous relationship between.
Yeah.
You're the only person I've met that actually has a needle in their notebook.
Yeah.
So you can actually stitch.
Needle and scissors. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
yeah.
That's really a revelation for me. I think it's so beautiful.
And then I like maps. Of course, are a part of place, and I'm very interested in maps of different types. And in Australia, I've studied quite a few of the Aboriginal dot paintings, which most people know they're beautiful paintings, but they're also maps of place. And and this is a map of my road here.
Oh, Richard.
This is a map of, this is probably one of the first maps in the Canadian archives of the road I live on, Richardson Road. And this is the Trent going up around and rapids here. So they needed to have a portage to get around those rapids. But
and Richardson Road was that portage.
Yeah, it was really. It's the first.
Is it? It's
on
First
the map?
Nations?
It's the first man-made passage on the map.
Right.
Everything else is water, because that's pretty much how they traveled. But it's a wonderful map with just this one little line, which is titled Indian Trail. Yeah.
So, I mean, it's just quite remarkable that you've situated yourself in this landscape, and it just, what's important about it to you is that there's this history here that most people wouldn't notice, right? You wouldn't be aware of it unless you dig a little bit and look closer.
This piece that's on the wall now has a sister piece, which relates more to the Australian outback. This piece is called Traces, and that piece is called Signs, and it has marks in it similar to this, but they're taken from these pieces that are on my wall here.
What are those?
Which are rusty pieces of wire.
Oh my.
And some seaweed. So some is from the Arctic, and some is from the old farm station that I stay at in the outback in Australia. So it's farm wire. But I love the shapes, and they're like little, to me it's like a language that we don't know what it means, but there's a dump there, which I spend a lot of time collecting rusty things and old cans, and again, it's a sign of human settlement. So those would have been the early settlers, European settlers, who left these in the dump.
It's a different kind of language, right?
A different language, and then only a few kilometers from that station where I work is a rock wall with beautiful Aboriginal chipped marks chipped into the wall. Very simple circles, dots, again, very simple marks, 30,000 years old.
Right.
And so those, again, are traces of human history, and it's to me, it's very powerful to look at something like that reaching out to you over 30,000 years. And we don't know the literal meaning of those marks, but we know that a human made them as a way of interacting. And so other piece has traces of those marks.
I've never thought of this expression before, but in some ways artists, and particularly in your work, are translators. We translate. I often use the word transform as to describe the creative process, where you take one thing and you make it something else. But in your case, there is almost an element of wanting to bring into the present a language and make it understandable. There's a bit of archaeology to
absolutely.
As well.
I think of all of my things that I've collected as artifacts, and for me that process of collecting is very important. Like to pick something up and the tactile, to touch something, makes it a part of you in a sense, and you see a shape, but you also can feel a shape, and that's become very much a part of my process, whether I'm collecting plants from a place that I can dye with and extract color from, or shapes that can be incorporated into a piece from a place, or whatever.
Well, then I can see why maybe painting was really limited for you, because painting is really just one or two materials. Let's say the surface and the paint, which of course now is industrially produced. Ever since the 19th century, you could just buy a tube of paint, whereas before the artists were more in tune with the materials where they mixed around.
That's true.
But this tactile element, it doesn't exist really in painting. It's just purely visual extraction. You see something, it goes through your body and it comes out your hand. But for you, the way you describe, and even the way you live in the world, your presence is very tactile, and touch is important in textile art, right? It's not purely eye.
Yeah.
So this is a really dumb question. What happens when somebody wants to touch your work?
Well, see, I make my work very durable because I have 3 dogs, and they all may be in the studio and they might lie on a piece and add some of their fur to it, which sort of becomes part of the stitching.
They're in it.
And I always find it kind of hilarious when a piece actually goes to a museum and it's conserved so beautifully, wrapped in paper. And I actually am fine when people come up and go like this, even though most museums will put up signs and say not to. But it's just a natural thing. I mean, we have cloth on, cloth in our lives is a tactile thing. It keeps you warm or protects you or whatever. You
also recognize in your work the impermanence of things, right? Because if you do, the whole purpose of a museum is to keep things permanent forever. Yeah. But your work is very much about life and death and the journey of a material, and you give agency to these materials. So you give them, when they arrive into your newly formed landscape, they take on a new life. With regard to the large piece that's hanging behind me, you mentioned that it had traveled on its own for 2 or 3 or 4 years and in Europe, and it had been shown, and now it's back home, and you're actually revisiting it.
Sometimes the big pieces are quite time intensive, and they sometimes go out to a show at a point where I'm not quite fully sure that they're completely resolved, and that was the case with this piece. And so it went out and toured about in the UK and in Ireland and for a number of years, but I knew when it came back I would be putting it up and having the distance of time or that I might be able to see what it needs. And when we unpacked it and put it up, I could see exactly what was bothering me about it, and I will be working on it again. And,
but it had its own life for 3 or 4 years, and it existed, and it's come back. It even though it hasn't changed while it traveled Europe, it in your perception of it, your perception of it has changed, because as soon as you opened it up, you realized, oh, this needs to have this or that.
It's funny with...
I see it as being consistent with your approach.
I think so. It doesn't bother me.
No.
And it's funny with it, I guess with anyone who's an artist knows this, that sometimes a piece just simply happens. And you just go, wow, that was so easy. And other times, I call them the teenagers, they're just such a struggle. You know, you work a piece and you don't want to overwork a piece. You work it and you put in, take out, and it's, you know, there are those pieces that are a struggle, and they finally usually resolve themselves. And, you know, that's just part of it.
When you were talking about the Arctic and Australia and the similarities and differences, where does color come into? How do you approach choosing color? Is it does it go through some sort of transformation between site and
I'm very
studio?
Graphic in my work. My work starts out as a group of marks, black and white marks, basically graphic, almost like a printmaker. And then the color comes in very small amounts. I almost think of the little squares of color that I put in almost as paint chips that say, this is what color it is. You know, much more, it's much more about the drawn mark and the printed mark, and then bringing color in.
Right. But you kind of respect the color as well. It's powerful. Color is very powerful, and you don't want to, you know, introduce it too loudly or too, because it may...
The color definitely, you're right. It definitely comes from the place.
The place, yeah.
And it can be quite literally from the place. When I was working in Australia, I used a lot of earth pigments that I gathered and rubbed into the cloth. So that was quite literally part of the place.
Tactile. It's all tactile. Even the color becomes tactile. That's actually a really
and I like working it. Like, I love that process of having a piece of cloth and working this earth into the cloth, you know, physically, and that's it is part of it.
Some of the work I notice is on felt. Is that a material that has certain properties that you like? Well,
it's always a problem of how to show textile, and you know, it's different than a print or a drawing, and so somehow framing it doesn't quite feel right unless it's a precious little piece that seems to need protection. So what I found as a way of showing the work is to attach the pieces to industrial felt, which gives them a bit of a presence. It gives them a bit of a thickness, and they can still be framed. People sometimes do frame them, but they can be put directly on the wall that way.
And mine is directly on the wall. I didn't feel inclined to frame it, so thank you for explaining that. It
is textile, and you know, if they are framed, they're often in a shadow box type of frame and lifted away from the back, so they have sort of an air around them. Just want to keep the sense of textile.
But the felt itself protects it too, doesn't it? You know, gives it a backing support. And it's a beautiful material on its own.
Yes, it is. I like it. Yeah.
It's interesting that you use the word industrial, because you distinguished that it's an industrial product. Obviously, felt could be made by hand as well, but that's a whole other thing. So there's a separation between the substrate, the industrial felt, and then the art is actually the thin, not necessarily always thin, but the thing that you've put together. I see bones, I see fossils, these beautifully wrapped packages, which look to be complete artworks unto themselves.
Well, these are really a form of journaling for me, or a form of recording a place. little cards, and they're easily carried out into whatever, the outback, or if you're walking on the tundra. They're easy to carry, and I call them collecting cards. So they each collect a part of the landscape, whether it's rubbing with earth. This was a dyeing with a plant material, or they might just be a leaf sewn on, or any one of these is not important on its own, but as a group, when you put them up on a wall, they speak to one another of a place. And I record where this was collected and the date, so they're kind of a ongoing journal. And
they are actually very colorful.
Yeah, well, depending on where we are, these are from Australia. There's some over there from my beaver pond down the road, which are not colorful.
They're different.
They're different.
Yeah.
That was from my first trip to Australia, and I decided to collect a page of earth each day as I traveled for 2 months around Australia, and so it's a book of dirt.
I love it.
And
it's
it's a quite beautiful.
It is. I mean,
Yeah.
if you don't mind me looking at it later, I'd love
Yeah.
that. And
So they can be. These were from Vancouver Island.
it's like lace work.
It looks like lace.
Yeah.
And they have wonderful lichens and so forth out there. Sometimes when I have an exhibition, have a piece of my studio as the exhibition. And so my last show actually had a whole separate room, which had some of my collections, the cards. There was a whole wall of collecting cards pinned with insect pins up to the wall. And because I feel it shows the process that these other studio pieces come from eventually. And and I like sharing. I love my studio. I love having these things around me, and they sort of inspire me and make me think of those places that I've been.
Well, it's inspirational for me too.
Yeah.
As an outsider, just thinking about your amazing creative world. Do you listen to music when you?
I listen to CBC.
CBC, yes. Any favorite programs?
Well, I generally like a lot of the programs that are late at night. I work at night, so I like the blues show and so some of the
That's marvelous.
late night shows. Yeah.
Well, Dorothy, I want to thank you for allowing us into your beautiful space and meeting your dogs. We need to do this more often. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming. Pleased to share it with you.